Hello everybody. So for this video, what we're going to be looking at is kind of what some call at times called the second New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. Basically, by 1934, Franklin Roosevelt, mostly through the various pieces of legislation that made up um, the so-called 100 days of his at the beginning of his presidency, had enacted a broad range of reforms. Reforms designed mostly to try to restore the American economic system without significantly deviating from capitalism. Roosevelt, in many ways, is actually fundamentally quite conservative in his approach to politics, and generally speaking, sought to avoid more radical ideas. Um, but ultimately, his various efforts had come up against staunch opposition on various fronts. On the political right, in spite of his various overtures to business leaders, like the National Recovery Administration, Roosevelt was seen by many as a traitor to his class, and many of his programs were oftentimes regarded as being socialistic in nature. And so he really failed to make any substantial headway amongst American business or financial leaders, most of whom actively despised Roosevelt with a deep passion. Um, and uh, in addition to that, another area where Roosevelt faced some pushback was from actually the most serious pushback that he faced was from his political left. Many felt that Roosevelt's early proposals, good as some of them were, did not go far enough in terms of providing direct relief to those who were suffering as a result of the Depression. And so as a result, Roosevelt faces substantial challenges from his political left, both from members of his own party, like Louisiana Senator Huey Long, as well as from more radical voices on the left, like members of the socialist and communist parties, which gained membership again throughout the 1930s, though perhaps not as much as they had been during the Hoover years. And as well as various other, kind of eccentrics who challenge his administration. He also faces off against popular radio personalities like Father Charles Coughlin, um, and who oftentimes gave these very anti-Semitic radio shows that basically blamed Jews for America's problems, and who was angered at Roosevelt for not including him more prominently in his administration. So Roosevelt faces a number of political challenges and a number of setbacks in the early New Deal. In spite of this, in 1934, for the congressional midterm elections, a time when presidents usually lose seats, when the president's party usually loses seats in Congress, if not losing its outright majority, as just happened in 2018 um, with President Trump. Um, that didn't happen to Roosevelt. Instead of losing his majority or seeing his majority weakened by public backlash, um, Roosevelt's ability to maintain a strong connection with the public helped him weather the political storms of some of the failures of the early New Deal. And he was able to not only hold on to his congressional majority, but actually to augment it, to add new seats to it. And so from that point onward, from the point when Roosevelt has this even bigger congressional majority, he really kind of shifts gears in the focus of the New Deal after 1934, from structural reforms and more towards creating a social welfare system in the United States, and promoting the interests of workers in a variety of ways. And it's this period that we see some of the most important and long lasting actions of the New Deal undertaken. One of the first things that Roosevelt decides to do is he decides to dramatically expand the public works programs that he had begun when he became president. Many of the most popular actions that Roosevelt took early in his presidency were public works programs like the CCC and the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, that had put out of work Americans back to work and provided them with a measure of dignity and a sense of fulfillment that they otherwise lacked. And so, recognizing how popular these public works programs, in fact, were, Roosevelt decides to expand them quite dramatically by bringing all of the various public works programs that have been created previously under one uniform umbrella by creating the Works Progress Administration. And what the Works Progress Administration ultimately does is it puts millions of Americans to work during the Depression in a variety of different types of government-sponsored employment opportunities. Now, most of what the WPA engages in is basically construction work, building roads and bridges, building dams, completing already begun projects and things like that. Some very well-known WPA construction projects, or projects, I should say, built with WPA funds, would include things like the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, the Golden Gate Bridge, and a number of other roads and recreation areas. The Great River Road in Illinois was built with WPA funds. So there's a lot of projects that are commenced as a result of the WPA in construction, which is what the majority of the work does. And that's very important because, again, that helps build that infrastructure that would eventually help enable the United States to wage, with comparative ease, a two-front war against Nazi Germany and Japan during the Second World War and after World War II, would furthermore provide the infrastructure to allow millions of Americans to move into the South and into the Southwest in the Sun Belt states by creating new infrastructure that prior to the 1930s simply did not exist. So it's another one of those things that has very far-reaching ramifications for American history. Now, in addition to the WPA, continuing and in many cases expanding massive public works programs like the Golden Gate Bridge and building various other roads and bridges and things like that throughout the United States, the WPA also was designed to provide cultural enrichment to the United States as well. To that end, the WPA employed thousands of artists, many of whom painted these very famous murals that adorn public buildings throughout the United States. This is actually something that they parodied quite effectively in Parks and Rec. But there's this very distinctive style of artwork, this very distinctive style of public artwork that actually emerges during this time period. Some of the best examples of which were commissioned and painted by Missouri-born artist Thomas Hart Benton during this time period. So there's this very strong and enduring legacy of public art that comes about from the WPA, in addition to the actual buildings and bridges and roads and things like that that the WPA creates. In addition to that, many musicians are hired by the WPA to write and record songs, including famous American folk singer Woody Guthrie, as well as writers like John Steinbeck, who received grants from the federal government for writing for WPA literature projects. Academics likewise receive grants through the WPA that have proven to have far-reaching impacts, such as the WPA's funded study into conducted by anthropologists who interviewed the last remaining living people who had been born in slavery, which provides us a lot of information and insight about life in in the institution of slavery. So a lot of this stuff has had very far-reaching and enduring value for the United States, both again in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of art and culture and things like that. And it proves to be very popular. And it puts millions of people to work, again, giving them an opportunity to provide for their families, to regain that sense of dignity that had been lost as a result of the Depression, and a sense of purpose in the process. Now, in addition to the WPA, another major thing that that FDR gets interested in after 1934 is labor reform. And this likewise will have far reaching consequences. Basically, at the time that FDR became president, roughly around 5 or 6% of the American workforce belonged to unions. And the majority of those were craft workers, skilled tradesmen who belonged to various affiliates of the AFL CIO. But during the Depression, there have been a number of, at times, violent strikes, such as the 1934 Longshoremen strike in San Francisco that was organized by the American Communist Party, which is one of the biggest organizers of strikes in the U.S. And so, recognizing the continuous labor unrest in the United States, but also wanting to, kind of weaken the inroads made by the Communist Party into the American labor movement, President Roosevelt in 1934 throws his support behind new labor legislation. That eventually passes a law written by New York Senator Robert Wagner, which for that reason is known as the Wagner Act, that is passed in 1935. The full name of Wagner's bill is the National Labor Relations Act. And what the National Labor Relations Act does is it basically is, as many at the time called it, it's a Magna Carta for labor. It basically, for the first time in American history, recognizes the right of individuals to organize and form and join unions. And moreover, it creates a legalized, regulated process for people to do that. Basically, what the National Labor Relations Act or the Wagner Act does is it basically creates a step-by-step process for people to organize and form unions on the factory floor, or at the company-wide level. Basically, first there is a initial vote that is held where people are required to sign out union cards stating that they would like to join a union. And once enough union cards are then signed, then the National Labor Relations Board looks at this, and if they determine that there have been enough signatures gathered and they've been gathered honestly, there is then an election held in the factory to determine whether or not the people in that factory become a unionized workforce. And if a majority of people in that subsequent election vote yes to join a union, then it then from that point onward becomes a unionized workforce. So essentially, again, what the Wagner Act does is it creates this legalized process, this democratic process for allowing workers to join, to organize and join unions. Initially, it doesn't get very far in terms of actually increasing organization in the United States, because in spite of the Act's provisions, many employers, of course, still continue to resist efforts at their workers to organize and form unions. And so ultimately, in the mid-1930s, a decision is made to try to organize the largest industry in the United States at the time period, which is the automobile industry. And so you get this group of workers who belong to an affiliate of the CIO, the Committee of Industrial Organizations, eventually the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which itself would eventually join forces with the American Federation of Labor, just to keep things confusing. And basically, they decide they're going to try to organize the biggest company in America, General Motors. At the time, General Motors is the biggest and most profitable corporation in the United States, and it employs thousands of people. Um, and so the idea was that if you can organize the automobile industry, if you can organize General Motors, you can organize the entire automobile industry, and then from there you can organize other areas of American life as well. And so they try to organize the automobile industry, which again, periodically people had tried to do before, um, oftentimes with deadly results, such as in the 1932 strike at the River Rouge plant in Detroit, Michigan, by Henry, the Ford plant in Detroit. Um, and so basically, what ends up happening is that in 1937, a group of workers decided to organize a strike at the Fisher Body plant in Flint, Michigan, which was the principal assembly plant for GM vehicles in the United States at the time period, or at least one of the principal assembly points for GM vehicles in the U.S. at the time period. Um, and they decided to go about doing this strike in a very novel way. Rather than picketing outside of the factory and trying to discourage the factory owners from bringing in strike breakers or scabs, as would normally happen in a strike, what the Flint workers decide to do is they decide to engage in a strike that combines elements of um, that it essentially involves nonviolent civil disobedience. They engage in what is known as a sit down strike. They literally go to work, clock in, and then they decide to sit down at their workstations and refuse to leave, locking themselves in the building and preventing the factory owners and managers from bringing in new strike breakers, or and basically grinding the the factory's production to a halt. This carries on for several months, several weeks and months in the winter of 1937, the bitterly cold winter of 1937. Um, Ultimately, after 46 days of these workers occupying this factory and grinding production to a halt, the managers of GM finally give in to their demands and agree to recognize their union, the United Auto Workers, and this therefore translates into the unionization of General Motors. And that really paves the way for a mass wave of unionization throughout American industry that'll occur over the course of the next 8 years. Within 3 years of the Flint sit down strike, all three of the big three automotive firms had unionized, and there had been some movement made into the steel industry. Ultimately, during World War II, as a result of conditions put into government contracts requiring factory owners to allow workers to organize and form unions, and because of the the processes created by the Wagner Act, the number of Americans who belong to unions skyrockets after 1937. By the end of World War II, in 1945, fully 30% of the American workforce, fully one-third of the American workforce, works in a unionized shop. And that in turn translates into higher wages, um, better working conditions, and generally speaking, a heightened level of prosperity that is one of the key components of creating the expansion of the middle class that occurs during the post World War II time period. So, this again is one of those things that ends up having very important long term ramifications for post war America. Basically, the union fights of the 1930s paved the way in many ways for post war prosperity, much in the same way as the infrastructure projects of the 1930s literally paved the way in a similar manner for wartime and post-war expansion as well. So it's a very important aspect of that. Now, following the passage of the Wagner Act, um, FDR decides to focus on another issue, and this is a reflection of a major criticism that had been leveled against Roosevelt by a California doctor, Dr. Townsend. Sorry about the kitty. And basically, Townsend had advocated for a old age pension for elderly Americans over the age of 65. At the time, elderly Americans disproportionately lived in poverty, um, and poverty rates amongst elderly Americans were very, very high. This is something that you see routinely reflected in period literature as well, in books like The Grapes of Wrath and various other, you know, types of period literature and movies. The poor, old are almost always portrayed as being very, very poor. And so basically, recognizing the popularity of this issue, um, as well as tapping into an unfulfilled promise from the 1912 Progressive Party platform of his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, which had called for the creation of an old age pension in the United States, modeled on that adapted by Great Britain. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt proposes Social Security. Now, the actual person who thought this up was his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, who also played a key role in the drafting of the Wagner Act. Um, and essentially, what they conceived of was a system of providing for the elderly and the aged that would survive political criticism. Basically, what they devised with Social Security was not a entitlement so much as an earned benefit. Basically, the idea behind Social Security is that instead of just simply paying direct cash payments to elderly people, the idea is that it's a system that people pay into throughout their productive years, throughout their productive lives. If you look at your tax stubs on your jobs, this is what's known as the FICA tax. And basically, the idea is that you pay into this every paycheck, a little bit here and there. And then once you reach the age of 65, having paid into it your whole life, you then are able to collect. And so basically, what Social Security does by paying these benefits based on monies that people pay into throughout their entire adult life, it creates a welfare benefit that is politically very difficult to challenge, because again, it's something that you know isn't just being given to people; it's something people actually pay into their whole lives with their taxes. And so that's ultimately one of the reasons why Social Security has remained um, not only one of the most effective social reforms to come out of the New Deal, um, playing a key role in dramatically reducing poverty amongst the nation's elderly and aged, which at present is very low and has been for several decades, but also in making it very popular and very difficult for opponents of Social Security, including um, those amongst Roosevelt's adversaries in the Republican Party who accused it of being socialistic, from trying to dislodge it. So, a very important and far-reaching reform. Now, after the passage of Social Security, the Wagner Act, and the expansion of public works with the National or the Works Progress Administration, sorry, um, Roosevelt had rather aggressively moved from a direction of a comparatively conservative approach to addressing the Depression to one that increasingly embraced many policies that had socialistic elements to them. And so that, of course, was something that was made a principal point of argument in the 1936 election by Republican Alf Landon of Kansas, who was Roosevelt's challenger in that year's election. However, Roosevelt ends up doing very well in the 1936 election, partly by embracing, literally embracing the hatred of America's business and corporate elites, saying that they are unanimous in their hatred of me, and I welcome their hatred. And so Roosevelt is able to easily win, a massive landslide victory with over 60% of the popular vote again in 1936. And once again, is able to continue with his large majorities in Congress, at least in principle. Um, in actuality, after 1936, the pace of reform does begin to slow pretty dramatically. Partly this is because of court challenges. The Supreme Court had ruled against several New Deal agencies, such as the National Recovery Administration in the past. They ultimately would strike down parts of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the first Agricultural Adjustment Act. And so one of the first things that, and arguably one of the most controversial things in his entire presidency that Roosevelt does in 1937 is facing Supreme Court challenges to many of his New Deal proposals. He proposes what comes to be known as a court packing scheme, in which he, proposes replacing every justice over the age of 70 with a new justice. Um, this proposal ultimately does not win the popular support that Roosevelt had hoped it would. Many saw it, as it indeed was, a gross overstepping of the executive branch into the realm of a co-equal branch of government and attempting to undermine it. Many saw it as an attack on the elderly by specifically signaling out people over the age of 70. And so ultimately, due to intensifying opposition and a growing coordination between Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans to oppose some of the more ambitious aspects of the New Deal, it goes nowhere. But it does end up having an effect. The Supreme Court ends up ruling in favor of many of Roosevelt's proposals, which many interpret as basically him having fired a warning shot to the court. The court takes heed. And ultimately, Roosevelt would appoint 8 justices to the Supreme Court during his 12 years in the presidency, more than any other American president in American history. And that would end up, of course, having a very long-term effect on the court's direction. Now, after 1937, like I said, Roosevelt faces increasing political headwinds to his expansion of the New Deal and various domestic programs, partly because of this new unified opposition between Northern and Western Republicans and Southern Democrats. The reason for this new kind of political fusion, this new kind of power block that increasingly blocks elements of Roosevelt's programs, is because in many instances, at least in the case of Southern Democrats, they were fearful that New Deal programs might extend benefits to African Americans, and they were angered at FDR for attempting to woo black voters into the Democratic Party from 1934 onward, a largely successful endeavor in the North, at least. It is worth remembering that the Southern wing of the Democratic Party at this point is still ardently segregationist, which leads to one of the principal failures of Roosevelt's administration during the New Deal, which is his general unwillingness to try to tackle segregation or discrimination in any meaningful way. His wife Eleanor does try to push him on this several times and clearly disapproves of segregation. But because of his reliance on Southern voters and Southern support, Roosevelt is oftentimes less than energized and less than enthusiastic about confronting racial disparities in American society. And it is worth noting that when many early New Deal programs are created, like Social Security, initially they're written in such a way that they largely exclude significant portions of the American workforce. For example, when Social Security was first passed in 1935, it did not include domestic or farm workers, groups which disproportionately included large numbers of African American sharecroppers and domestic workers in the South. So, again, um, definitely not one of the brighter aspects of his presidency. Um, but at any rate, the other factor that ultimately inhibited Roosevelt's success after 1937 was in part his own limitations. Like I mentioned, um, Roosevelt may have embraced populist rhetoric and embraced the idea and embraced to a certain extent the idea that the government should play a big role in promoting economic activity and growth, but he still remained relatively fiscally conservative in his mindset and didn't want big government spending to become a permanent fixture, at least not initially. And so when the economy showed signs of improvement in early 1937, by which point employment had dipped down below 15% for the first time since 1929, he decides to try to cut some of the government expenditures and programs um, in his in the New Deal. And this ends up backfiring because he does it prematurely, and it causes a double dip recession, sometimes known as the Roosevelt recession. And as a result of this, there is a general decline. Sorry, I have a cat. Anyway, and he's very loud and annoying. It does cause a bit of a decline in support for his policies. It causes unemployment to surge back up, and really it won't go back down again until the United States enters the Second World War. It is, again, worth mentioning that for all of the effects that New Deal policies have during the 1930s, the New Deal alone does not break the back of the Depression. It isn't until the full mobilization of American economic resources that is brought about by American entry into the Second World War that the Depression is finally and definitively beaten in 1941 and 1942. So, that is, I think, an important thing to mention. But anyway, after 1937, there is a gradual loss of support for a lot of the kind of far-reaching reforms that Roosevelt had launched into in the middle part of the decade. He does manage in 1938, in spite of mounting opposition, to get through two important pieces of legislation, two additional important pieces of reforms. And these are really generally considered to be two of the last major New Deal policies. The first is a rewrite of the Agricultural Adjustment Act that corrects some of the problems associated with the first iteration of the act. Specifically, what the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act does is instead of encouraging farmers to destroy produce to qualify for allotment payments at a time when millions of Americans are going to bed hungry, instead, the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act creates a system in which the government can buy up agricultural surpluses and then distribute them to needy families with ration books, or as they come to be known, food stamps. So that's actually the origin of the concept of food stamps, because when it was originally created, it was quite literally a booklet with stamps for specific types of produce that you could then, if you qualified, go to government agents to receive agricultural surpluses from. A fact that is still reflected in the fact that the current food stamp program is referred to as the supplemental nutritional program. So it's still fulfilling the same basic idea, just in a somewhat different form. But anyway, so that's an important reform through the passage of this Second Agricultural Adjustment Act that addresses one of the central failures of the first one, and that instead of just simply destroying excess food, it allows the government to buy the excess to then distribute it to needy people where necessary. Um, the other major, and arguably the last major reform of the New Deal era, comes that same year with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act is one of the last New Deal reforms, but it's definitely one of the most important. Basically, what the Fair Labor Standards Act does is it does two things. The first thing it does is it finally abolishes the regular employment of children under the age of 16 in the United States. So it finally abolishes child labor, a goal of progressive organizers and causes since the 1870s. So this is something that had been a long, long time coming. The second thing that the Fair Labor Standards Act does, in addition to outlawing finally child labor effectively in the United States, is it also fulfills the long-standing progressive idea of creating a living wage or minimum wage, depending on how you frame it. Though it is very clear from his writing and speeches at the time period that Roosevelt intended it to be a wage that would provide a minimum standard, a floor that would enable people to provide for themselves and their families. So, but the Fair Labor Standards Act does establish the nation's first minimum wage, which at the time is 25 cents. Again, like many New Deal programs, it has loopholes and exemptions in the way it is written. But again, this is a major breakthrough and a long sought after goal of reformers in the United States. Again, this is something that had, like Social Security, had been outlined previously by Franklin Roosevelt's cousin Theodore Roosevelt in the 1912 Progressive Party platform. So another long-term goal that finally comes to fruition. Now, by this point, by 1938, attention really does begin turning away from domestic reform. And the reason for this is pretty simple. By 1938, the emergence of totalitarian regimes in Italy, in Germany, and in Japan had brought the specter of war back upon the United States and the world. And a big part of the reason why Roosevelt and many others began shifting attention away from domestic reform after 1938 is because they begin looking at the war clouds that are rapidly growing over Europe and Asia and other parts of the world, and which will shortly consume the world for the second time in global conflict. So that's all for that. We'll talk about that in the next video.